Is soccer actually the easiest sport? That has been a question that has recently been brought up again, and in this video, I will try to answer it. I will talk about the 5 biggest team sports in America because Americans are really the only people who generally say that football is the easiest sport. These sports are hockey, baseball, basketball, American football, and football. Also, I will be looking at every sport fairly and logically. I will look at the difficulty of each sport at the professional level. But first, let's take a look at the video that inspired this whole discussion. It is from Dana White, the president of the UFC.
Can't stand soccer. I think that it's the least talented sport on earth. There's a reason 3-year-olds can play soccer, okay? Run around and kick a ball. Yeah, Landsberg said, you wouldn't say that if you were Brazil. I said, dude, I say this in every country. When you're playing a game where the net is this big and the score is 3-1, are you me right now? You know how untalented you have to be to score 3 points when the net is this big? Now in hockey, you have guys on skates, right? With crooked sticks where they have to hit a puck into a net that's the same size as the goalie, okay? That's a sport that the score should be 3-1.
He says football is the least talented sport on earth, which to me is just crazy, but I guess it depends on what he considers talent to be. He also says there's a reason 3-year-olds can play it. This is where I struggle to believe that he even genuinely believes what he is saying, because this argument, if you want to call it that, can be used for all sports. 3-year-olds can also wrestle, punch, and kick each other. Why doesn't he say that the UFC fighters that he is employing have the least amount of talent? 3-year-olds can also throw and dribble a basketball. He would never say that basketball is the least talented sport. Then he simplifies the sport by saying you can just run around and kick a ball. This is just so silly. Every sport can be simplified in this way. American football is just throwing and catching, basketball is just throwing a ball into a hoop, and baseball is just hitting the ball with the bat. This is just exhausting to hear so often from people who are clearly just ignorant to the sport. Then he criticizes football because the scores can be 3-1, and he implies that this score is too low. Interesting. He would never say this about American football, even though the score is sometimes 21-7, which is the same as 3-1. Except football doesn't add imaginary points to make the viewers more excited. Also, football isn't a sport that is dominated by how many points are scored. You can dominate a game of football and still lose, which is what makes it so interesting. Sports like basketball and American football are dominated by scoring points. You dominate a basketball game by scoring more points than the other team. These sports have a clock limit, and the sport's entire intention of every play is to either score or progress the ball further up the playing area to get within a range to score. In football, it is a bit different. It is a fluid sport that doesn't require set-up plays with a time limit. Dana White uses the low score comment to support his argument that football is the least talented sport because the players struggle to score a lot of goals. First of all, 4 goals in a game is a lot, but even if the score was 1-0, that doesn't mean the players are untalented. It might mean the exact opposite. It might mean that both teams were so talented defensively that it was difficult to score. This idea that it is easy to score in football because the goal is so big is just so stupid, and I don't know how people think like this. Okay, now that Dana White's entire argument is debunked because it is stupid, we can move into my answer of the original question. Is football the easiest sport? The short answer is no, but it depends on the way you look at the sport. Let's look at the 5 major team sports that I mentioned earlier at a professional level and try to decide which one is the easiest. And this is where the difficulty begins. Remember, this is at a professional level, the top of the sport. What you think is the easier sport depends on what you value in a sport, physical ability or technical ability. By this, I mean athleticism versus the mastery of a skill that requires more than just athletic ability. I think that a lot of Americans say that football is the easiest sport because they view sports as solely physical activities and don't care too much about the technical ability that is needed to play sports, especially football. This is why you might hear the argument of, well, in American football you get hit harder. So those people will value the physical ability of the athletes and of the sport higher and will say that the sport is the hardest because you get hit hard. Since we're already on the topic, let's look at American football first. So, American football is primarily a sport based on physical ability rather than technical ability. Most of the players excel with things that are physical and trained athletic traits, such as speed and strength. A lot of the sport requires tackling other players and being in tough contact with opponents. Also, some of the players require speed when running routes or running with the football. I would even argue that catching is more an athletic trait than a technical one, but I could see how catching could be viewed as both. There is only one player on the American football field at a time who possesses technical ability, and that is the quarterback. Passing the football is a technical skill that is mastered over time and practice, and this is a skill that you can't just replicate without being elite at the skill. This isn't to say that other players on the field haven't reached elite levels in their positions, but I would argue that reaching elite levels in technical skills is more difficult than becoming elite in physical ones. If you don't agree with this, then we will fundamentally disagree with everything about every sport, which is fine. Also, kickers in American football have also mastered a technical skill. Just thought I should mention them too. So, as we can see, this sport relies primarily on physical ability, which is perfectly fine and is difficult in its own right. Next, let's look at professional hockey. This is a sport that I've never really watched, but it's still easy to understand the fundamentals of the sport. This is a sport that takes both physical and technical ability at a very high level. First of all, to be able to skate with such speed and sharpness is extremely difficult, not to mention that it is also filled with plenty of contact, so there is a lot of strength and balance needed as well. On a technical level, skating to me is a technical skill. I've been ice skating twice before, and I don't think I could ever skate with the amount of ease that professionals do. Also, to skate at that high of a level and control the hockey puck is insane. I don't think I'll ever be a fan of hockey, but the difficulty of the sport, both physically and technically, is unreal. Next, let's take a look at basketball. Basketball also looks like an extremely difficult sport to play on a technical level. Shooting, dribbling, and passing the ball are all technical skills that the players have to develop. However, some players might not necessarily have to develop each skill to an elite level, but they have to be elite at something. However, even though basketball does require a lot of technical ability, it also heavily relies on physical attributes. You have to be tall to play basketball at a professional level. Height is not something you can gain by working hard or practicing, it is something you naturally develop, which I kind of don't like about the sport. You can be elite at everything in the sport, but if you are 5'7", you will never, ever, ever get a sniff at the top of the sport. Next, let's take a look at baseball. Baseball is an interesting one because it might have the most difficult technical aspect in all of team sports, but it also probably is the one that requires the least in terms of technical and physical ability combined. Hitting a baseball is extremely difficult, and even at the professional level, it is something that can't ever really be mastered. The timing and coordination needed to hit the ball even a little bit is insane. Pitching is also a technical skill that is needed, but it is obviously not as difficult as hitting, but it is still difficult in its own right. Apart from that, the sport is not insanely difficult compared to the rest that I already mentioned, which is fine because the whole sport revolves around pitching and hitting. It isn't physically draining, there isn't any contact, and you don't really have to possess any insane skills outside of hitting. It sounds like I'm hating on baseball, but I'm just trying to be extremely fair to each sport. Baseball is obviously not easy at all. Last but not least, we have football. Football probably requires the most on a technical level compared to other sports. Mostly everything a player has to do is a technical skill. Shooting, passing, dribbling, and control of the ball, which is something like a player's first touch. Many people who have never played football don't realize that these things are incredibly difficult to do at an elite level. They think it is easy to shoot, and when they try to shoot, they end up doing a mistimed run up and strike the ball with their toe and look like the goofiest people on the planet. Also, all of these things are done at game speed. Dribbling, shooting, and passing while on the run are incredibly difficult to execute perfectly. Also, every player in the field has to be good at all of these things, even the goalkeeper, especially in the modern way the sport is played. It's honestly incredibly difficult to explain how difficult these aspects of the sport are, especially to people who believe it is easy. People who think it is easy wouldn't even be able to score a goal from outside the box using proper technique. They wouldn't be able to accurately connect a 10-yard pass. Their first touch would be non existent, and they wouldn't be able to dribble at all because their feet and brain would malfunction. Now, football is also one of the sports where you don't necessarily have to possess any sort of physical trait to be elite. You don't have to be strong, fast, or tall. This is why a lot of Americans think it is a weak sport and that it is easy because you don't have to be any of those things. The greatest player of all time is 5'7", and one of the best midfielders of all time is built like a twig. This is because this sport is dependent on IQ and technical mastery. If you are just an athletic freak, you will not be able to play football. You will be looked at as a bum. For example, Adama Traore is one of the fastest and strongest players in the sport, and he is also one of the least effective players I've ever watched because football doesn't care about how fast or strong you are for the most part. However, football is probably one of the most difficult sports in terms of endurance, and having a decent amount of strength does help a lot because there are constant duels that players engage in. Things like agility and balance are also incredibly important. So, I obviously didn't mention every little thing about every sport, but I think I mentioned enough for each sport to be somewhat fairly represented. Of course, there is a whole nother aspect of the sport that I didn't even get into, which is all the tactical side. And I didn't get into that because I don't know enough about the sports tactically to be able to explain the difficulty in each one. Now, which sport is the easiest at the professional level? I don't really know, and I don't really have an answer. Again, it depends on what you think makes a sport easy or hard. If you value mostly physical ability, then you will probably think that American football is the hardest because those players are the strongest and they get hit very hard, and most of the sport relies on physical traits. If you value technical skills and mastery of skills, then you might think football is the hardest because everything you do with the ball requires elite skill. If you value both physical and technical ability, then you might think hockey is the most difficult sport because it is impressive in both those areas. If you still think football is the easiest sport to play, fair enough, but I hope I changed your mind at least a little bit and helped you realize that it is still incredibly difficult. This argument was about the professional level, but the answer to the question could differ if we look at every sport at an amateur level or even a resources level. By this, I mean what every sport requires in terms of equipment in order to play. If that's the question, then football probably is the easiest because you need a ball and that's pretty much it. But I think talking about these sports on a professional level is much more interesting. That will be the end of the video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Please tell me in the comments which sport is the easiest and why. Thanks for the massive support, and thanks for watching.